Authentication refers to how a user identifies themselves when connecting to the database. There are two types of authentication mechanisms: SQL Server authentication and Azure Active Directory authentication. So you can see here on the slide we've got SQL Server, we've got Azure Active Directory. The login details and the server level firewall rules are cached in each database. Now this cache is periodically refreshed, but you can refresh it manually running a dbcc flush auth cache to manually flush the authentication cache. Now this statement doesn't apply to the logical master database because the master database contains the physical storage for the information about logins and firewall rules. The user executing the statement and other currently connected users will remain connected. So SQL Server authentication is similar to what we have on premises SQL Server, which it requires a username and password to be supplied. When provisioning an Azure SQL database, you have to provide a server admin login with a username and password. The user has admin access on the Azure SQL Server and DB owner access on all databases in a particular Azure SQL Server. There can only be one server admin account in an Azure SQL database. Now, Azure Active Directory, or AD authentication, allows users to connect to an Azure SQL database by using identities stored in Azure Active Directory. When you create an Azure account, it creates a default directory for your account. And this is where you can add users and give them permissions to access different Azure services as is appropriate to them. You can add custom domains to the default directory, or you can create directories from here as well. And you can also integrate your on-premises Windows Active Directory to Azure AD using Azure AD Connect. There are three different ways to authenticate, and they are Active Directory Universal with MFA support, Active Directory Password, and Active Directory Integrated, as you can see from the drop-down list in our Management Studio here. Active Directory with Password. This is the easiest way to get started with Azure AD. It works with Azure AD Managed Domains and Federated Domains. The user authenticating to the Azure SQL database has to provide an Azure AD identity and password for successful authentication. So you can see on the screen there the drop-down list we have chosen Active Directory Password, and we are providing a username and password. Active Directory Integrated. This is similar to the conventional Windows authentication on on-premises SQL Server. To authenticate using this method, a user has to provide the domain account which has access to an Azure SQL database. The user doesn't have to provide a password, it's validated against Azure AD. Now, in order to use this method, the on-premises Active Directory should be integrated to the Azure AD, and this can be done using the free tool Azure AD Connect. When using SQL Server Management Studio to authenticate using Azure Active Directory integrated method, it will automatically take the username as the logged in username, similar to on-premises Windows authentication. And you can see there we're just passing through the local Windows user and no password is needed. Now, MFA, Active Directory with Universal MFA support. MFA stands for multi-factor authentication, and MFA allows you to provide a code received by a call, text message, or by some other means. This further secures the authentication process, as the code received is only accessible by the person who has initiated the authentication process. Multi-factor authentication requires you to provide a username which is pre-populated after you configure MFA. Now, Azure Active Directory authentication isn't supported when connecting to an Azure SQL database from a SQL Server on an Azure VM. You should use a domain Active Directory account for that.